I keep office hours. I work from 9:30 to 6. It's curious, in the morning I can just about tie my shoelaces before noon, but I can write. It's obviously a different part of my brain that's working. Morning you just, you write for maybe 3 hours, but you're still just preparing. But about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, one has sunk to such a level of concentration that I don't know who I am. Time expands and contracts. I was working one day in my study, my wife put her head in at the door and said, "I'm going to the shops." She closed the door and then opened it again. I said, "I thought you were going to the shops." She said, "I have been to the shops, but I had no sense of that time having passed. I was in a different temporal area. And that's where you really concentrate. You forget yourself, you forget your surroundings, you forget everything. The language. Everything comes out of the language. Plot, character, everything. And it's the sentence. The sentence is how I work. That's a unit that I work by. Joyce worked by the paragraph. Very few people have noticed that, but Joyce was a master of the paragraph. I'm not very good on paragraphs, but I'm not too bad on sentences. And each sentence generates the next one. If you get a sentence as close to being perfect as you can, which is still pretty far away from perfect, but it's as close as you can get, then that generates the next one. And I trust the sentence to create characters, to make a plot, to carry me along. Anyway, what's the point of a plot? Has life got a plot? Not that I know of. So why should novels have a plot? But it has to have some kind of story. It has to have some kind of structure. Well, I try to have a sense of immediacy. It seems to me that the only reason to make a work of art is to try to make the reader or the listener or the viewer feel, taste, hear, smell the world as it is. But of course we don't do it as it is. A novel is nothing like the world and nothing like life, but it produces a wonderful simulacrum of it, strangely compelling, parallel version of the world that people think is real. I wrote a book once about Johannes Kepler, the great astronomer, who lived in the 1600s, and people said to me how well I'd caught the period. I was too polite to say to them, "How do you know?" But they were giving me a wonderful compliment. They were saying, "You created something here that looks and sounds and smells to me what I imagine the 1600s were like." So that's all we can do, is give. It's a kind of glorified transcendental lying. That's what fiction is. I love telling lies. I love making stories. I love interpreting the world. I think this is why I started to write, in order to interpret the world to myself, because I didn't understand it. I found it baffling. I find the world baffling. I think the only reason that we're not constantly surprised is that, as Beckett says, habit is a great deadener. But the sky is an extraordinary phenomenon. You look up and you're looking into infinity. And then the clouds come along. Clouds are the most amazing things. The sea is amazing. It's flat. Everything else in the world is, up and down. The sea is flat. And you walk along the land and you come to this extraordinary flat phenomenon. Never ceases to baffle me. I think it begins as a kind of tension in space. There's something out there and it's waiting for the Big Bang, and I have to get that into my head. It's beautiful. I have a composer friend in Ireland, and he put it beautifully. He said, "I have this scream in my head and I have to get it into the orchestra. I have to get it into the music." And I wouldn't be quite as dramatic as that. But I have this tension, I have this thing that has to be done. And the problem is, you see, once you've got the first paragraph down and you've got the tone, then the bloody book is written. All you have to do is fill it in then, which makes it really boring. I mean, I'd like to be like one of those Japanese artists, just go, and it's done. But no, it takes years. The first paragraph is the absolute, for me, it's the essential. One of my books, I can't remember which, I spent, I think 3, maybe 4 months writing the first paragraph. Sometimes I was just writing it out, same paragraph, trying to get the tone, because tone is everything. Now, don't ask me to explain what tone is, but I have to hear the voice. And every novel has its own voice and its own tone. Once you get that, then you're going. And curiously, it has a lot to do with getting the names of the characters right. If you go through Henry James's notebooks, you see long lists of names, possible names. Now, how do you know a character's name is right? You don't. But somehow it makes a chime. It just sounds, it feels right. And that is very important for me. I have this very rich, poetic voice that I hear myself reading in. I do a sort of cadence, chanting it. I'm not aware of doing it. That's for the rhythm. You have to get, rhythm is almost as important as tone. I've been planning, for the past week, I've been planning writing and rewriting the first sentence of my next book. Over and over again. I sent my wife 3 separate versions of it by email last night, asking her which sounds best. And I'll be doing that for weeks and weeks and weeks. But when I get that sentence right, then I'll know that I can get going on the first paragraph. When I get the first paragraph as near to right as I can get it, then I'll be on my way. I just ask her opinion. She has perfect pitch as far as my work is concerned. One of my books, I remember, she took me away for a weekend after I'd given it to her to read, and she said, "You can't do this, you can't publish this. You'll disgrace yourself." I started bluster, and she said, bluster away, but you know yourself it's not right. And of course it wasn't. And I had to go back through it and, like clawing sort of grass out of a pond, getting rid of the awful stuff that was there to leave the clear water behind. You have to do what's difficult. You have to push yourself beyond what you know you can do. Otherwise, it would be so boring. It's immensely hard work, but what's the point of doing easy work? It's immensely rewarding, it's immensely infuriating and painful and horrifying at times. I remember when I was doing one of my books, it was giving me such trouble that I sat down in a chair one day, couldn't do anymore. And I actually had a vision of myself writhing in pain on the floor. So it's terribly, terribly difficult. But, that's the only anything worthwhile doing is always difficult. I write 24 hours a day, even when I'm asleep, especially when I'm asleep. We all write when we're asleep. As Nietzsche said, every man's an artist when he sleeps. You make up these fantastical worlds, people you've never met, places you've never been to, things you've never done. And for the period that you're dreaming them, they're absolutely real. Extraordinary phenomenon. And now I've come to an age where I keep waiting to the day when I will forget a word. And I'll have forgotten it in such a way that I know it's gone. And that I know dementia is coming on. Maybe then I'll give up. I might go back to painting then. Maybe I discover that I wasn't too bad after all. But there's a wonderful story of Henry James when he was dying. He was in a coma. His hand was moving across the sheet. He was still writing. That'll be me. Writing till I fall off the edge. Well, W.H. Auden said that an artist should be loaded with, in childhood, should be loaded with as much trauma as he can bear, because it will do him good in later life. I was misfortunate that I had a happy childhood. At least when I look back on it, it seems to have been happy. Boring, of course. I mean, I regard childhood as a complete waste of time. My own children, I told them to grow up as quickly as they could and stop all this nonsense. Stop. Apart from anything else, children just pretend to be children to save the embarrassment of adults. He worked in a very big garage and motor supply, motor parts supplier. And he was very proud that he wore a white collar, but over his suit and his white shirt and his tie, he wore a brown coat, so he was sort of halfway between white collar and, as you would say, blue collar. My parents were simple people, very clever, not well educated. My mother was like Irina in Chekhov's Three Sisters. She longed to go to Moscow. Moscow for her being Dublin. And at the end of her life, she moved to Dublin, and of course, it wasn't Moscow. It wasn't even Dublin. It was a dream, and you should never move to your dream place. Keep the dream. A young man once phoned up Ava Gardner in her old age and said, no, Rita Hayworth, it was Rita Hayworth. He said, I would really love to meet you. I think you're the most beautiful woman in the world. And she said, I'm not now. Keep the dream. So she didn't meet him. It wasn't a big reading household, no. My mother read magazines, my father read Wild West stories. You see, it was a small town, it was a bleak time, late 50s, early 60s. Everything arrives 20 years later in Ireland, so the 60s arrived in the 80s for us. So it was I needed to escape from the world that I lived in, but I also needed to enter into it, and writing allowed me to do both. And my brother and sister, who are older than I am, yes, they would have encouraged me. But I don't think either of them ever went so far as to say I have a gift. I think they just regarded me as an annoying little twerp, and they would encourage me in order to get me out of their hair. I think I was about 12 or 13, and my sister gave me a copy of James Joyce's story collection, Dubliners. And I was amazed to discover that fiction could be about life as I knew it. You know, here was writing that wasn't a crime novel or a school yarn or a Wild West story. This was about ordinary, grey life. But by the power of imagination and the power of language, Joyce showed the ordinary to be utterly extraordinary as it is. Joyce said, and I agree with him, he said, I've never met an ordinary person, nor have I. My mother said to me, if you want to do this artistic stuff, why don't you become an architect? At least then you get a job and make money. So to please her, I went along for a little while with the notion of being an architect, but I had no gift whatsoever for architecture. I knew what I wanted to do. And I wanted to get away from home, and I wanted to travel. Doesn't every child want to get away from home? I want to start one's own life. And we're completely callous when we're young. We just walk away from our parents, you know, as if, oh, don't bother me anymore. Which, of course, I feel horribly guilty about now that it's much too late. But I wanted to be free. I wanted to be free. And I went to work for the airline for Aer Lingus because that was the way to travel. I had a job as a clerk, which was not interesting in any way, but the travel was superb. I mean, I remember taking a flight, first class, Lufthansa, direct from London to San Francisco for £2. A lot of the travel was free. And in those days it cost about £250 to come from Dublin to London, because, you know, ordinary people didn't travel. It was just business people and the wealthy. So here was a wonderful way to travel. So I got to go to Paris, I got to go to Rome, I got to go to Greece, I got to go to America. It was wonderful. I met my future wife in San Francisco in 1968. I was in Berkeley in May 1968, where she lived. I can still smell the tear gas. And then the following year we moved to, I spent a year together in London. And then we thought, when I finished my first book and had it accepted for publication that year, then we thought we would go back to Ireland for a year or two. We're still there. I can't write anywhere else. I need the Irish climate, which is the most wonderful climate in the world. People are constantly complaining about it. It's a marvelous climate. The light is so beautiful in Ireland. It has this pearly sheen to it. Even in high summer, and the odd days when the sun shines, it still has that lovely, steely, pearly shade that I cannot do without. The only other city I've ever come across the same light is in Copenhagen. But I love it. Oh, I love rain. Rain is the most extraordinary phenomenon. When it rains, we should be out cheering. Water falls from the sky. Isn't that a miracle? You know, just you're walking along, suddenly water is falling on you. And it's making things grow. And it's washing the streets. After a time of drought, you can see the trees, you know, when rainfall, you can see the trees just drinking it in. It's wonderful to watch, in springtime especially. Well, I have a theory, this is my pet theory, and I'll be as brief as I can. We lost the Irish language in the middle of the 19th century, during the period of the famine in the 1840s. We did this extraordinary thing of giving up Irish and moving to English. It never happened anywhere else. We gave it up. We decided, as a people, we didn't make an agreement, we didn't have a consensus, but we just quietly gave it up and took on English. But the English that we took on was like the Latin of the Roman Empire, which is a language of command, of narrative, of plain speech, of direct speech. Whereas the Irish language is a very oblique, very poetic medium. And I often think of the Irish language as a mode of evasion rather than of communication. And when you put those two together, you get this strange new language, which we call Hiberno-English, which is a marvelous literary medium. And I think it's because of the richness of this language that we have that we produce so many Anglo-Irish writers. We love ambiguity. George Orwell said that prose should be a pane of glass that you look through at what's being said. For us, language is a lens, and lenses distort. They get you closer to the thing, but they do distort. But they're also very highly polished. So that's what we did with the English language. We took it and rejoiced in it. There's a pun. Imagine being described as a non-imaginative writer. No, I just, as I said at the start, I just find the world incomprehensible. And I think I've fixed on writing as a way to try to explain it to myself. Well, not to explain it, to account for the world to myself. I think all advice is useless because nobody ever takes it, and quite right too. But my own mottos are: don't imagine for a moment that you're going to be able to express yourself. That's not what art is at all. And most aspiring artists think I have something to say. My friend the novelist, Will Self, has a wonderful witticism. He said, it's true, every man has a novel in him, only he shouldn't write it. But I have two mottos, one from Kafka. The artist is the one who has nothing to say. Okay? And the other is from one of the ancient Romans, Cato the censor, who had a wonderful, he said, rem tene verbum sequenter, grasp the object and the words will follow. And that's, don't think about what you think about the world. Don't think about your feelings or your emotions or your aspirations. Think about the object. The poet Rilke, one of the great poets, 20th century, when he was young, he worked briefly for Rodin, the sculptor. Rodin said to him, you know, you're much too precious. He said, tell you what you'll do. You go to the Jardin des Plantes, go to the zoo. Pick an animal and spend a day. He said, just sit on a bench, watch that animal. Then go away and write a poem about it. And it was one of the first of Rilke's great masterpieces, The Panther. Very short poem, but it's absolutely perfect because it's not about Rilke's feelings or anything else. It's about the panther's feelings and what it's like to be a panther. Because that's what art is. Art is what objects are in themselves, not what you are. I have nothing to say. My wife found a photograph of herself when she was in her 30s. She gave it to me and I put it in below on my work desk, but I had to put it away. It was too distracting. It's a terrible life in a way. We're inhuman, you know, we're cannibals. We eat our children. We would exchange our children for a good sentence. We're monsters. Writers never talk about writing. Writers only talk about money and how dreadful their agent is and how badly their publisher is treating them. That's all we ever tell. That's why writers are so boring. We all hate each other, you know, we're all jealous of each other. I remember the first time I met Martin Amis. I was coming over to London. I wrote to him and said, let's have lunch. This was a long time ago, 35 years ago. And we met, and two not very tall men, you know, sizing each other up. We met in a little restaurant in Ladbroke Grove. We started polite conversation. I said, look, Martin, let's stop this. You hate me and I hate you, right? If you win a prize, I hate you. If you get, you know, a rave review, I hate you. Same with me. Martin said, you know, you're right. And we've been friends ever since. We do hate each other. Nobody's more jealous than writers, artists. And they're always saying dreadful things about each other. My favorite at the moment is somebody asked Braque about his old friend Picasso when they were both old. And Braque said, Pablo used to be a good painter. Now he's just a genius. Isn't that wonderful? John McGahern, a wonderful Irish novelist, the late John McGahern, whose reputation has dipped a bit because every writer's reputation dips after you die. It will come up again. But he and I were good friends. And we were having a drink one night and we agreed that the only reason that we could be good friends is that our writing was so different that we weren't in competition. The ones I admire most would be Henry James. I think he was the greatest novelist of all. The number of masterpieces that he left behind is extraordinary. Nobody else came up to that level. And I can't talk about present-day people because it would be invidious. You know, if I mention one, I have to mention them all. In Irish writing, I think that certainly people in my generation, we went either the Joyce route or we went the Beckett route. You know, Joyce put everything in, Beckett took everything out. And, you have to choose one or the other. I chose Beckett. But God knows my writing is not Beckettian. But Beckett's writing is much richer than, I don't know why people think of Beckett as bleak. He's also one of the funniest writers that ever wrote. Superbly funny. And his works are extremely rich. But the curious thing is that he started to write in French, pour écrire sans style, as he said, to write without style. And I think he succeeded. From what little French I have, I see that Beckett's French seems kind of stilted. But when it goes into English, it comes alive. There's a wonderful thing in one of the novels, I think it's Malloy, where he says, morning is the time to hide. They get up, what is it? Morning is the time to hide. They rise, hale and hearty, their tongues hanging out for beauty, order and justice, baying for their due. There's a wonderful canine image going through that. That's not in the French. I've just written the sequel to Henry James's Portrait of a Lady, which has just been published. Probably for my next book I will revisit some of my characters from early books and meld them into I'm also writing under my pseudonym of my disgraceful twin Benjamin Black. I'm writing an erotic mystery set in Venice in 1900. I mean, it's not going to be pornographic. Pornography is just boring. It's like, reading about plumbing. But the erotic is such a subtle form. And it's so, it vibrates in a way that's, all good art is erotic. It should make you feel slightly feverish, slightly overexcited, slightly lost to yourself. So by doing that, but it's a Benjamin Black book, so I can't give it all that much time. Publishers, we set limits, but they know that I'll either meet it or I won't. People always complain about their publishers. I've never had anything but wonderful publishers and editors. I don't know what people are complaining about. People who work in publishing still are dedicated, they're selfless, their names don't get onto the title page. Sometimes they get into the acknowledgements at the back, but that's about it. But they're selfless people who want to produce good work, in the sense of publishing good work. They want it to be as good as it can possibly be. I picked Benjamin White because he was a character in one of my early novels that I'm glad to say nobody reads anymore. And my publishers, my agent, said, we think black is better. It sounds better, it looks better if you're going to write mystery stories. Also, it'll be much higher up the librarian's purchase list. It usually takes about 4 months to write a Benjamin Black book. Real crime writers get furious when I say this, because they say, oh, it takes you so long to write your Banville books, but you obviously just, you're cheapening yourself. I said, that's not the point. To write crime fiction, mystery stories, you have to do it quickly and spontaneously. Georges Simenon, the greatest of them all, he wrote his books in 10 days. Summer is the most boring season of all. I really hate it. So I kill the summer by writing a Benjamin Black novel. Nothing's happening. The leaves are green, and then they're green, and then they start to turn grey, and the earth just sits there doing nothing. In autumn, the place just goes into mad colour, even in Ireland. In America, autumns are extraordinary. Spring is too disturbing. It's too, the gets the blood going, which is not good if you're sitting in a room for 8 hours a day writing. In winter, you can feel the ground quaking as all that potential life is just getting ready to come up in the spring. These are the wonderful seasons. Whereas summer is just summer. People are going on holiday. I hate holidays. I really, really hate holidays. They're no fun at all for me. I want to be at home. Look, to enjoy a holiday, you have to not enjoy your life. And I love my life, so why do I want to go away from it? I had a wonderful postcard from the playwright Brian Friel. He was in France on holiday, and he said, "Here for 2 weeks, one with good behavior." I think one should stay at home. I have a plan that when I finally give up this writing business, I will become a travel agent. And my travel agency, the stipulation of it will be that you cannot travel more than 20 miles from where you live. So you have to have your holiday where you live. I mentioned this once to a couple in Portland, Oregon, and they said, "It's funny you should say that," because they said, "We were supposed to go to Europe last summer. And for some reason they had to cancel. I can't remember what the reason was. But they said, we told nobody. We didn't even tell our family. Didn't even tell our children. But we just hired a luxury suite in a hotel in Portland and had our holiday there." And they said, "We saw a whole side of Portland we'd never seen before." And they said it was just an absolutely delightful holiday. My daughter works as a tour guide in Paris, and she said the one thing I've discovered is that 99.9% of people do not want to be on holiday. It's the last thing they want to be doing. They don't speak the language. They don't like the people in the country they're in. The food sickens them. They want to be home. They miss their kids. They should stay at home. Tourism is destroying the world, absolutely destroying the world. I mean, I remember the first time I went to Venice with my wife and my 2 little boys, and I discovered this entirely corrupted city, a city that had been completely corrupted by tourism. All they cared about was money, 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 as much of it as they could get out of us. And it was awful. Here they were living in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and all they cared about was money. There must be something in our brains that the triad must be, because it's the same in music, it's the same in religion even, you know, the Holy Trinity, as we used to be told. I was always fascinated by the Holy Ghost. God the Father and Christ I can understand, but the Holy Ghost? Who's he? What does he do? So I think the triad is built into our deep mental makeup. Also, you know, when you write a book and you think that's done, and then you think, no, it's not, and then you try to get it right, so you do another one. And then you say they were both wrong. I'll do a third one, and that will get it right. And it doesn't, and then you give up, move on to something else. Oh, I hate homework. It embarrasses me. All I see are the faults. Gary Larson has a wonderful cartoon in 2 parts. The top part is a flower bed, and the flowers are absolutely beautiful. It says how people see flowers. And in the second half, they've all got cross-eyed and snaggle teeth. The caption is how flowers see themselves. Well, that's how I see my writing, cross-eyed and snaggle-toothed. As my wife said once, you know, if you get it right, you'd stop, and then what would you do? Go into politics, and God help us all. The ego of the writer is so enormous. And look at the 20th century. All the great monsters, they were all failed artists. Hitler wanted to be a painter, Stalin wanted to be a poet, Mao wanted to be a poet, Pol Pot wanted to be a poet. Nothing more dangerous than a failed artist. But I got so sick of it that I couldn't face it, working on it anymore. I gave it up. That's what we do, you know, you just give it up. Paul Valéry said, work of art is never finished, only abandoned. I've got it to a point where I'm just sick of it. I want to get rid of it. But I think the better answer is that, and when I was a teenager, I tried for a few years to be a painter. Again, no talent whatsoever. But it did teach me some painterly lessons. And one is that, and I think all painters know this, I've heard them speak of it, that you get a painting to a certain point, even an abstract painting, and you know that if you apply one more piece of colour, the whole thing will just turn to mud. And I think it's the same with the sentence. Get to a point where you know, if I keep fiddling with this, it will die, it'll go dead, it'll become dull. It's absolutely extraordinary. That is the one sentence that everybody remembers from my books. I don't know why. It hit some chord. It took me about 10 seconds to write. I didn't even think about it. But for some reason, it just lodges with people. They departed, the gods, on the day of the strange tide. All morning, under a milky sky, the waters in the bay had swelled and swelled, rising to unheard of heights, the small waves creeping over parched sand that for years had known no wetting save for rain, and lapping the very bases of the dunes. The rusted hulk of the freighter that had run aground at the far end of the bay longer ago than any of us could remember must have thought it was being granted a relaunch. I would not swim again after that day. The seabirds mewed and swooped, unnerved, it seemed, by the spectacle of that vast bowl of water bulging like a blister, lead blue and malignantly agleam. They looked unnaturally white that day, those birds. The waves were depositing a fringe of soiled yellow foam along the waterline. No sail marred the high horizon. I would not swim, no, not ever again. Someone has just walked over my grave. Someone.